Before we begin our program, let's take a moment to acknowledge that if we were at Old North Church, we would be on land once lived on and stewarded by the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been displaced from their land, and they had been decimated by disease and war. The story of the Massachusetts people is one of community, of pain, of courage, and of survival. Let us remember them and learn from their example of caring for this land and its resources. So, on behalf of all of us at the Old North Foundation, welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining us tonight and for supporting our speaker series programming. We hope that you'll also join us next month when Dr. Tad Baker will give a talk about the Salem witch trials as a failure of leadership. It's a new approach to a story we may all think we know. So when many people think about Old North, they recall the famous lantern signal on April 18th, 1775, and the examples of active citizenship shown by so many that night, including Paul Revere and the lantern holders. But that's just one night in 300 years of history. And as we say to our visitors pretty much every day, we have so many more stories to tell. And we have many, many more stories to recover. The Old North Foundation is committed to gaining a better understanding of its own history and of all the people who've built and been part of the Old North community for 3 centuries. To that end, we are investing in research. We seek a fuller, truer narrative of this iconic space, of this community of faith, of this sometimes paradoxical symbol of freedom. Tonight, Dr. Jaimie Crumley will talk about how she is going about recovering these stories. Jaimie is the research fellow at the Old North Foundation, and in addition to her own research, she supervises our 3 research interns and has quickly become an integral member of our education team. We feel lucky indeed that she is spending this year with us before she takes up her assistant professorship at University of Utah. Those of you who follow us on social media may have already met Jaimie through her video series, Illuminating the Unseen, in which she dives into primary source materials and demonstrates how one can read them to find the narratives under the narrative. And if you haven't watched the videos yet, I urge you to do so. Her methodology is fascinating and in some ways challenging, as it requires a relentless honesty about ourselves as much as about what the research process uncovers. This is the first of 2 talks that Jaimie will offer this, academic year in order to share the progress of her research. We are hoping for a lively Q&A and urge you to put questions in the chat as they occur to you. And if you're not familiar with Zoom's chat feature, you just click on the word chat at the bottom, type your question and hit enter, and we will see it. So, it is now my absolute pleasure to hand the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Jaimie Crumley.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Catherine, for the warm introduction. Right now, Jason Fishman is going to share a transcript of this evening's talk as a PDF in the chat. I'm circulating this PDF for accessibility purposes, so if it helps you, use it, and if it doesn't, you can just leave it where it is. However, please don't cite or circulate the transcripts. I also will say that I've made some edits to it since I sent it to Jason this morning, so if you're reading along and things don't quite match up, it will link up eventually. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And so you can type in the chat if I'm sharing and you can't see anything. Great, so it looks like you should be able to see everything. So as Catherine stated, I'm Jaimie Crumley. I'm the research fellow at the Old North Foundation. I started in June of this year, and it has been a wonderful experience. I'm really grateful to everyone on the staff who supports my research. This academic year, as Catherine mentioned, I'm on a research leave from my position as an assistant professor at the University of Utah, where I have a shared appointment in gender studies and ethnic studies. My areas of expertise are African American religious history, American religious history, Black feminist thought, Black studies, archival studies, and United States gender history. I am also an ordained minister in the American Baptist tradition. And since my ordination, I have served churches in Connecticut and also here in Massachusetts. Intellectually, personally, and professionally, I am constantly drawn to the question of what it means and what it has meant to be a non-white person who identifies as a Christian in the context of all that has happened in the past 500 years of Atlantic world history. This is a question that is at once broad and narrow, because the experience of Christianity has never been a monolithic experience, and it's become even more thorny and complex since the Protestant Reformation began in the early 16th century. This question also offers a reminder that history is not contained in the past. It echoes into our present moment. My talk for this evening is called Black Women and Children in the Archival Records of the Old North Church, 1723 to 1800. As the title suggests, we will discuss my experience learning more about colonial and revolutionary era Black women and children's experiences in Boston through the records of the Old North Church. This talk will cover the years from the time the church opened its doors to worshipers in 1723 until 1800. The Old North Church's archival records have been held at various repositories over the years. In the church's early years, it held its own records. In the 1930s, the records were held at the Boston Athenaeum and later at the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Between 2004 and 2006, they were deposited at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is where I have done the bulk of my research. And I'm grateful to the staff there for encouraging all of us in the research that we're doing. The staff at the Boston Athenaeum has also been supportive, both while I was finishing my dissertation and now. I am also grateful to the archivists at the Massachusetts State Archives and the Lambeth Palace Library in London, who have helped me to navigate their digital archives. Thank you also to my colleagues, my division chairs, and my dean in the School for Social and Cultural Transformation at the University of Utah for their excitement about this project and for allowing me this research leave. I hope our time together this evening will be interactive. Please feel free, as Catherine said earlier, to leave your questions and comments in the chat while I'm talking. I will try to respond to everything that you ask during our question and answer time. Please also use the chat anytime just to say hello and let us know where you're joining us from this evening. I would love to know more about all of you who have joined us in the virtual room. Our plan for this talk is as follows. First, I will share some historical context about the Old North Church in Boston's early years. Second, I will share my positionality as a researcher who is producing an intellectual and social history of the people who were part of this congregation in its first 77 years. Third, I will share two stories that make Black women's and children's lives in 18th century Massachusetts visible. I will show how Black feminist archival reading methods allow us to expand the legibility of archival materials, to see Black women and children where they might have otherwise been rendered invisible. Finally, we will have time together at the end to engage with each other about some of the ideas that I will discuss in this talk. Please feel free to leave questions and comments in the chat while I'm talking. Before we discuss the church's history, I will offer a brief word about some of the terms that might come up during this talk. We are going to discuss race, gender, and religion today. These are ideas that have had a shifting meaning across time, and therefore people have used different language to talk about them at different times. When possible, I will use contemporary language to avoid replicating past harm by repeating words that have a painful or violent history. However, at times I will show images that contain language that some people might find to be distressing. If you see words that upset you on the screen, please try to sit with the feeling. Think about why that feeling is welling up in you and consider productive uses for your feelings. In the second half of the talk, I also will discuss the sexual violation of enslaved Black women, which was common in the colonial period. I want to alert you that sexual violence is part of our conversation tonight because it is a topic that I know upsets many of us, and I want everyone to be prepared. However, I will not show images on the screen that depict violent actions. Regarding religion, I'm going to be sharing my research about some of the things that religious people have said and done in the past. During this talk, when I talk about religion, I am always either talking about institutional histories of houses of worship or the intellectual histories of people who have belonged to houses of worship. In other words, when I discuss religion, I am referring to this church's history or the history of other churches as public-facing organizations, or the ideas that people who were part of this church or other churches shared through their actions and their writings. I am not casting judgment on anyone's faith tradition or questioning anyone's personal belief system. When we study the past, it helps us to remember that people who lived in the past were fallible, just like we are. We can learn from their mistakes and triumphs and allow those lessons to shape us as we work to become better humans. Now I will share some historical context about the Old North Church's unique early years during the British colonial period. American religious historian Harry Stout argued in his book, The New England Soul, that although New Englanders perceived themselves to be the predestined founders of the American Republic and therefore custodians of its mission, that idea is more fiction than fact. New England developed differently, economically, politically, socially, and religiously than other parts of the so-called New World because of its founders, its approach to religion and education, its climate, and its economy. When I tell you about the earliest years of the Old North Church, we should recognize that this history is distinctive. As I will demonstrate throughout this talk, the church's early years are intertwined with a history of colonialism and slavery. In this way, this church is not distinct from other New England churches that had wealthy parishioners. However, as a Church of England congregation in revolutionary Boston, the church's history is unique and allows a rare opportunity to consider the complexities of political life in 18th century Boston. The church began due to the efforts of members of the Church of England in Boston who wanted to create space for the church to continue to grow in New England. In 1722, King's Chapel, which was the first Anglican parish in the British colonies, had become too full to accommodate its worshipers. The minister of King's Chapel, Reverend Samuel Miles, was urged by gentlemen who had already purchased a piece of land to call for subscribers to make financial contributions that would allow them to build a second church in Boston's North End. That church would become Christ Church in Boston, or the Old North Church. The original building still stands on Salem Street, making Christ Church the oldest church building in Boston. While we often think of Boston as one of a few cities in the American colonies that was most resistant to British rule in the colonial period, the city's growing Anglican population in the decades preceding the American Revolution indicates that political opinions in Boston were far from monolithic. Furthermore, although Anglicanism was never the dominant faith in colonial New England, the rise of the Church of England in Boston meant that British authority in New England, much like Puritan authority, was understood to be rooted in Christian beliefs. This shift changed the character of the city and should also change how we interpret the city's religious and political history. Although the men who first moved to the peninsula that indigenous peoples called Shawmut and formed a city there were congregational Christians who protested English rule, Bostonians maintained a complicated relationship with their British homeland. While congregational Christians were developing a distinctively New England Protestant identity, New England's Anglicans were an English church in the American colonies. The growing Anglican community in New England indicates that early Bostonians included people who were loyal to Britain, people who wanted freedom from what they perceived to be British tyranny, and people who were on the spectrum between those two political opinions. Life in colonial Boston was uncertain because people lived between the British Empire, what would become the American Empire, and other European colonial powers that were quickly making inroads in the so-called New World. Congregational or Puritan churches dominated the colonial religious landscape in New England. Puritans were former members of the Church of England who wanted to purify the Church of England of its seemingly Catholic tendencies. They believed in a simpler form of worship. Many had simple meeting houses. The churches existed both as places to worship and sites of discipline and community management. Puritans looked askance at celebrations like Christmas, which they viewed as pagan rituals. As a Church of England congregation, Old North developed in ways that were unlike their Puritan neighbors. Church of England congregations in New England more openly flaunted the wealth of their members, had ornate worship spaces, and celebrated rituals and religious holidays with gusto. Therefore, we cannot directly apply our ideas about Puritan culture in New England to the Old North Church. Out of the so-called wilderness that New England Puritans intentionally created, emerged a tradition that was neither meek nor lowly and was led by ministers who necessarily had close connections with England. Because of their connections with England, they largely remained loyal to the crown and British imperial policies more broadly. Religious historians of colonial New England often center our attention on Puritan or congregational church history. In this region, the history of the Church of England has largely been neglected by scholars, including me. In my dissertation, I wrote next to nothing about the Church of England or its ministers. But I am now learning that including the Church of England's history and the history of other non-Puritan religious traditions in our study of colonial New England religion allows us to tell a more nuanced story about race, belonging, and national identity. Although the Congregational Church had significant social and political power in colonial New England, the Church of England found powerful and wealthy supporters in New England. Church of England members in colonial New England included newcomers who clung to the faith of their homeland, and merchants and mariners who wanted to maintain their social, political, and economic connections to London. Their connections to London allowed them to participate in the British Empire's trade networks. So having received sufficient donations to start building the church, Christ Church in Boston, or the Old North Church, opened its doors to worshipers in December of 1723. At the first congregational meeting, which was held on April 6, 1724, they voted that there would be 2 church wardens and 8 vestrymen. At this time in the church's history, only men could serve as wardens and vestry members. The first church wardens were Thomas Graves, Esquire, and Anthony Blount. The vestrymen were Henry Franklin, John Corney, Edward Watts, George Monk, John Gibbs, North Ingham, Gilham Phillips, and Robert Temple. Together, the wardens and the vestrymen were the administrators of the church's secular and ecclesiastical affairs. Many of these men owned enslaved people. For example, Robert Temple and his wife Mehitable were married in Boston in 1721. Upon his death in 1754, Robert Temple left his children and his widow with land across New England and with enslaved people, including Brandon, Henry, and Mallow. While some of Old North's earliest parishioners held Black enslaved people in New England, most of their enslaved people lived in various parts of the British Empire. If we track their finances and travels, we find that they and their families trafficked Black people throughout the Atlantic world on ships and managed plantations in the West Indies. Those who were not enslavers were connected to families that were. The church has a compelling local history here in Boston, but the church has also, from its earliest days, been intimately intertwined with the local histories of other places in the Atlantic world. Church membership at Old North worked a little bit differently in the colonial period than it does today. As was the case in other 18th and 19th century churches in early America, people subscribed to own pews in the church, which transformed the churches into sites that perpetuated the racial and social strata that existed outside the churches. Some people bought half a pew and others could afford to purchase an entire pew. Payment also allowed the purchaser and their descendants to enjoy the pew forever, so long as they continued to contribute financially to the church. Some people chose to transfer their pew ownership to a family member or a friend when they could no longer afford it. Others left their pew as a gift to a family member or a friend in their will when they died. When a pew had no proprietor, it was returned to the church for its use. Pew proprietors were crucial to the longevity of most 18th and 19th century churches because they provided ongoing financial support that churches needed so that they could continue their work. However, the concept of pew ownership was, of course, exclusionary. Owning a pew did not make one more pious, it was merely a sign of wealth. It also granted a person the power to serve on the vestry and to vote in church meetings. Some of Old North's pew owners also owned pews at other area churches or allocated money in their will to help make decisions about what would happen in Boston's Anglican community after they died. Of course, there were also people whose names do not appear in the church records, who were likely regular Old North attendees, along with transients who occasionally attended services. Some of these might have included white indentured servants of some of the pew owners. Perhaps some of these anonymous attendees aspired to church membership. Others might have enjoyed the freedom and autonomy. Black and Indigenous peoples could not own pews in any churches in colonial Boston, no matter how much wealth they had. Because they were shut out from pew ownership, they also could not serve as formal leaders in the church. Because churches were a significant part of social and political life in early New England, Black and Indigenous peoples' inability to participate fully in decision-making within their church communities reinforced their status on the outskirts of civil life in New England. Although they could not own pews or participate in the church's democratic process, Black and Indigenous peoples were part of the rituals of the Old North Church, and they melded Anglican traditions with other religious and cultural traditions that were dear to them. Before I share more about where Black women and children fit into this church's social, political, and religious history, I will share my positionality as a researcher and how my positionality factors into the way I approach my work. As a scholar who studies race and gender in American history, I find that it is essential for us to be ethical in the ways that we approach our research. Part of research ethics is to be aware of who we are, where we come from, and most of all, what desires and expectations that we bring with us to our studies. While I do not think it is possible for any of us to do completely unbiased research on any topic, because we are humans, I would argue that research on race and gender is especially politically charged. We live in a context where we are all constantly racialized and gendered, and we bring those experiences with us to our research. The term positionality comes to us from the field of sociology. One of the important lessons that sociologists have taught us is that many of the identity markers that we treat as real or stable are artificial and have changed over time. For example, the idea that I am a Black American woman is an artificial construction that functions to make sense of my presence here at this moment. I am here in this present moment holding on to these identities because we are living through the ongoing crises of colonialism and globalization and in the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade. The idea that I am a Black American woman only emerges because European empires wanted to expand their reach across oceans, thereby displacing Native peoples and their homelands and forcibly bringing African peoples across the Atlantic Ocean to places that they otherwise might never have been. The labels that all of us have today are a way to make sense of our subjecthood because of our shared past histories. Hopefully we can reclaim them for better ends, even as we recognize how dangerous they are, so that we can come together and create a more just society. The sticky and challenging thing about the concept of positionality is that it ironically flattens the complex identity markers that it's trying to highlight. Everyone has a different way of navigating their social identity markers. In addition to our social identity markers, we also have personal experiences that influence how we come to understand the world. For example, when I research, it's important for me to realize that when I study archival materials, I do not represent every Black American woman. Therefore, when I do my research, I understand myself as a political subject because of my Black womanhood. Black womanhood is an identity that I share with lots of people around the globe. However, I'm also an individual with individual hopes and desires that are born of my personal lived experiences. As I work, I bring with me my understanding of my Black womanhood. I never separate my identity as a Black person from my identity as a woman, because as a Black feminist theorist, I argue that Black people have had gendered experiences that are unlike that of any other group in the United States, and I would venture to say in the Atlantic world in general. The way we conceive of gender and gender difference in the United States is a colonial imposition for the colonized and a relic of the violence of the transatlantic slave trade for people of African descent who are the descendants of enslaved people. If you have questions about how I'm thinking about gender for Black people, I can discuss it more during the Q&A. When I work, I also bring with me my identity as a United States citizen who is the child and grandchild of veterans. I bring with me my identity as a Baptist. I bring with me my age and my marital status. I recognize the way that these identities and the way I interpret them can bias my work. And I also recognize the way these identities enhance my work when I am aware of them and use them as assets to read materials that so many historians have studied over the past 3 centuries with a new set of interpretive lenses. I've spent the past few minutes discussing how I bring my knowledge about my positionality with me when I do archival research. However, I also bring my Black feminist interpretive lenses to other aspects of my life. I believe our awareness of who we are and what we believe can help us to become more empathetic humans. We can talk more about positionality and research ethics during the Q&A. And before I transition us back to our topic for this evening, I will say that one thing that I love about Boston's North End neighborhood is that it is an excellent place for us to study how ideologies about race, and especially how ideologies about whiteness, have been made and unmade over the past nearly 400 years of white European history here in Boston. What is especially cool about the North End and Old North's place within its history is that it offers a case study for us to see how the United States racial history is entangled with religious history. The next 2 sections of my talk are organized around 2 stories. As I discuss the archival materials that I have used to learn these stories, I will use Black feminist archival reading methods. Black feminist historians and theorists, including Hazel Carby, Sadia Hartman, Jennifer Morgan, Jessica Marie Johnson, Marisa Fuentes, Aisha Finch, Martha Jones, and Sarah Haley, have critiqued dominant archives, which have so often obscured and erased Black women's stories, and especially the stories of Black women's resistance to state violence. Through my telling of these 2 stories, I will demonstrate how Black feminist methods allow us to expand the legibility of archival materials that are centered around white supremacy and Black death, and reread the documents as sites of Black sociality and possibility, where white supremacy only intended to produce impossibility. I can discuss more about Black feminist archival theory during the Q&A if you all are curious, but for now, I think it's best for us to delve directly into the stories. The first of the 2 stories emerges subtly in church vestry records. It connects the Old North Church to histories of slavery and sexual violence in Barbados. I will use that story to demonstrate that slavery produced what Black cultural studies scholar Christina Sharp has aptly described as monstrous intimacies in her book of the same title. Early parishioners at Old North used those intimacies to provide financial resources to the church. The second story does not appear in our church records, but a close reading of it connects an 18th century participant in Old North's religious community, to the larger story of slavery and Black women's resistance to it in colonial Boston. The story that this second record tells allows me to demonstrate how Black feminist approaches to reading and interpreting archival materials allows us to expand the legibility of text, to see the stories of Black women and their political work where it might otherwise not be visible. The first story involves a merchant whose name was Gidney Clark. As I go through this section, you'll notice that there are different spellings of Clark's name on different documents. And that reflects the general inconsistencies in the way that names were spelled in the 18th century written documents. In Travis Blasson's book, Mastering Christianity, and Jared Ross Hardesty's book, Mutiny on the Rising Sun, both scholars discuss Clark and his connections to transatlantic networks of trade. I recommend reading both books to learn more about the Church of England, slavery, and the Atlantic world in the colonial period. In his book, Blasson discusses Clark's connection to the Codrington Plantation in Barbados. In 1710, when Christopher Codrington, who was the former governor general of the Leeward Islands, died, he left the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, his sugar plantation, along with all the enslaved people who worked on it. Codrington wanted the land to provide revenue to support the construction and maintenance of a college to train Anglican clergy. The society never really got the college up and running, but the site did function as a place to convert enslaved people to the Anglican tradition while continuing to justify the brutality of slavery. For those who do not know, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was the largest and most influential missionary organization in the 18th century British Atlantic world. It sent Anglican clergy to places throughout the British colonies to Christianize the people who lived there. Old North's first minister, a former congregational minister named Timothy Cutler, was ordained in London because at the time, the Church of England did not have a system that allowed Anglican clergy to be ordained in the colonies. After his ordination, it was the society that appointed him to Old North, which they called a mission church. The society supported the founding of the Old North Church, with Cutler as its rector, because they hoped the church would serve white Europeans in Boston and lead them to return to the Church of England. However, the society also encouraged its ministers to try to convert Black and Indigenous peoples. Cutler took the society's encouragement seriously. As you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, he wrote to the society about his church in Boston, his son's ministry, and lay people's needs. And on the right side of the slide, you can see that he preached a sermon during an annual meeting of the society in which he urged enslavers to incorporate enslaved people into their spiritual lives by bringing them to church and teaching them Christian values. However, like other ministers in the society, he was pro-slavery. We can talk more about the society and their work during the Q&A. The American Revolution shifted Black enslaved people's relationship with the Anglican Church. While the church continued to largely function during and after the Revolution as a pro-slavery and anti-Black organization that described slavery as a reforming institution for Black people increasingly participated in the transatlantic Black freedom movement. They were only interested in Anglicanism as so far as uniting with the British cause would guarantee them their freedom from enslavement. During the decade of political upheaval in the 1760s and 1770s, Codrington Plantation did not change their policies. The society purchased the Henley Plantation so that they could obtain a large number of what were called at the time seasoned slaves who would work on the Codrington Plantation. So-called seasoned slaves were those who had already worked in the colonies and were believed to be more prepared for the demands of plantation labor than newly arrived enslaved people from West Africa, whom enslavers believed died too quickly after being introduced to plantation labor in Barbados. The problem with the society's plan was that it was extraordinarily costly, and it could only work if they would be able to recoup their investment. They needed to sell the newly purchased Henley Plantation to a third party. And that brings us back to Gitney Clark, because he's the third party they chose. He failed to make his payment to the society. Like historian Jared Ross Hardesty, I have found in my research on Clark that although he eventually became one of the British Empire's wealthiest merchants, he is a bit of an enigma. He appears randomly in correspondence with London's leading merchant firms, planters in the West Indies and Southeastern colonies, business partners, and family friends. One set of records in which his name randomly appears is the vestry records of the Old North Church. At a vestry meeting at Old North on August 26, 1742, the meeting minutes state that Mr. Gitney Clark at Barbados had been generous enough to order Captain George Ledane to pay a sum of £100 toward a ring of bells for the church. The minutes order the church wardens to give Captain Ledane an appropriate receipt and to write a letter of thanks to Mr. Gitney Clark. When I read these notes, I wondered who Gitney Clark of Barbados was and why he was donating a substantial amount of money to provide bells to a Boston church that he did not attend. I learned that Clark was born in Salem, Massachusetts, to Francis and Deborah Clark on April 5th, 1711. Throughout his life, he maintained his relationships to New Englanders, although he lived primarily in Barbados. On June 1st, 1734, he wed Mrs. Mary Florian at St. Michael's Parish in Barbados. Mary Florian was the daughter of a planter and merchant. Records indicate that Gitney Clark died in Barbados on August 27th, 1764. His son, Gitney Jr., followed his father's practice of marrying into a planter's family. For the Florian Clark family, intimacy was a way to build wealth and power through illicit trade networks. Gitney Jr. and his wife, Frances LaSalle, had sons Edward, who was born in 1765, and Francis, who was born in 1767. In his book, Hardesty explains that Clark was a business associate of Captain Newark Jackson. Jackson was an Old North Church member who submitted a deed to purchase Pew 13 on May 29, 1739. Jackson was also a notorious smuggler and participated in trafficking Black African people throughout the Atlantic world. Now, the story doesn't end with Gitney Clark Sr. and his sons. Another Gitney Clark appears in Barbados church records on January 26, 1788. He was among the list of those who were baptized into the Church of England that month. I quickly made a note of the name, assuming that this must be a grandchild of the Gitney Clark who donated the money for the bells at the Old North Church. But then I looked again, not only at the Gitney Clark entry, but at the whole page, and saw something unusual. Like the Old North Church, the Barbados Church baptized Black people. However, most of the Black baptized people whose names appear on this page were people of African descent. They were Black and mixed race people of African descent. The unexpectedly large number of people of African descent who were baptized is a reminder of the racial demographics of the Caribbean, where Black and Indigenous peoples always outnumbered white colonizers and enslavers. However, it also points to the tremendous reach of the Anglican Church had into the community of enslaved and free Black people. It also provides a hint of how the Black Anglican or Black Episcopal community in the Americas came to be. This powerful community, which emerged both in the Caribbean and in the United States urban centers in the late 18th century, is one that I will study in future research. In Barbados, it seems that the society accomplished its conversion goals. The list of the baptized included people of all ages. The 1788 Gitney Clark is described as a mixed race boy. He is also called the property of William Southwell. I don't think that the reappearance of the name Gitney Clark in Barbadian church records 24 years after the merchant Gitney Clark's death is a coincidence. First, I don't think it's a coincidence because the name Gitney Clark is completely unique. But I also don't think it's a coincidence because unlike other enslaved people in the Atlantic world, he is called by his full name. And his full name included the surname Clark, not Southwell, as it might be expected, since Southwell was his enslaver. Considering his young age, I assume that William Southwell was his first enslaver. This name indicates that perhaps 1788 Gitney was a son or grandson of the Gitney Clark who donated the Bell money, and that he likely gained through his, that perhaps the Gitney who the 1788 Gitney comes from is the son or the grandson who had participated in illicit trade networks and the brutality of plantation slavery in Barbados. A son or a grandson of Old Norse Gitney likely had sexual relations with a Black or a mixed race woman who was likely enslaved and perhaps the family's property, and they named their child Gitney Clark. The only lingering concern is how he came to be enslaved by William Southwell. The American colonies deviated from British common law by asserting that children born to Black women would inherit the status of their mothers. That means that when enslaved Black women engaged in consensual or non-consensual sexual relationships with white men, they knew that they would birth children who were not legally entitled to any part of their father's social or economic privileges as a white man. Likewise, when Black enslaved women engaged in consensual or non-consensual sexual relations with Black and Indigenous men, whether or not those men were free, they knew they would birth children who would never legally be free. Thus, enslaved Black women's bodies were rendered the central power axis of white supremacy, and their wombs became sites of social death. Sexual violence, maternal mortality, and a lack of reproductive rights continues to be a key political concern for Black women in the Atlantic world today. If my thesis about the young mixed race Gitney Clark is correct, it is a reminder to us that the transatlantic slave trade was both a form of systemic and intimate violence. Like other slavery studies scholars who have recently explored the linkages between sexuality and slavery, I find that we cannot talk about the crisis of slavery without also talking about Black women's sexuality. We cannot talk about the crisis of slavery without also talking about Black children. Perhaps I would do better to say that we have to talk about what historian Wilma King has called their stolen childhoods. This is especially true for those who were birthed through sexual coercion, and we can only imagine that under conditions of enslavement, most were born under coercive conditions. We can talk more in the Q&A about this legacy of intimate violence for Black birthing parents and their children. When we discuss the transatlantic slave trade and just how intimately violent it was, we must remember that many of those intimacies played out in everyday interactions in churches. Although the Old North Church's 1742 vestry record indicate that Gitney Clark was a man of means, it tells us nothing of the intimate violence that he did to acquire his financial assets. The vestry agreed to provide a receipt and to thank him for the gift. My study of the records in Barbados indicates that he and his family were all active in the Anglican Church. And if the mixed race Gidney Clark was related to the earlier Clarks, his presence in Barbadian baptism records demonstrates the family's, sorry, my battery is running low. Someone upstairs is going to bring me a charger. His presence demonstrates that the family's lack of regard for enslaved women and their children. His name, the same name that the merchant planter ancestors had when they participated in illicit trade throughout the Atlantic world, indicates their lack of shame about their actions and indicates that their behavior was commonplace among their peers. So during the remaining time, I'm going to discuss one more story. Our second story depends entirely on one primary source, which is held at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The Massachusetts Historical Society's digital catalog includes it on a page that lists several of their holdings about African-American history. The document is called The Last and Dying Words of Mark, aged about 30 years, a Black man who belonged to the late Captain John Codman of Charlestown, who was executed at Cambridge, the 18th of September, 1755, for poisoning his above said master. Charlestown is a neighborhood that is located on a peninsula north of the Charles River, about 1 mile north of the Old North Church. I requested Mark's testimony because I love a good resistance story, and I was hungry to read one after reading pages of stoic Old North Church records. But I did not expect it to yield anything that connected to our subject for this evening. My expectations were wrong. Mark's testimony changed the way I framed my comments this evening.
Jaimie, could you share your screen?
Oh, sorry.
No, it would be great. Thank you.
Well, you all didn't really miss anything because oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm not a host anymore, Catherine. So yes, I was trying to share my screen, but I cannot. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to continue on with my talk and someone let me know when I'm able to share my screen again.
You are good to go.
Okay. Okay, great. So this is the slide you all missed. A written record of Mark's testimony, which was sold next to the prison on Queen Street, and which I can only assume was reprinted as pro-slavery propaganda, tells us more about the nature of slavery in the colonial period. It reveals how we might think about the connection between Barbados and Boston. It also reveals how enslaved men and children, men and women, interacted, and how actively Black women participated in violent rebellions against slavery. It also reveals how much religious beliefs factored into the ways that enslaved people came to understand themselves in colonial New England. Finally, the list of signatories, Isaac Bradish, James Boyd, David Cutter, and Samuel Hyde, reveal that while Mark's execution was unusual in colonial New England, white Englishmen consented to actively participating in reinforcing ideas of Black inferiority. Signatory David Cutter connects Mark's death to Old North Church history, as Cutter and his wife, Mary Dix, were married by Old North rector Timothy Cutler in 1755. Before his execution, Mark accepted responsibility for his part in poisoning his enslaver, John Codman. Codman was the fourth man to enslave Mark from his birth in Barbados around 1725. Mark recalled that he had been brought to Boston while he was still very young. Mark's comments about leaving his home while he was still very young remind us of the toll that slavery took on Black children, who were separated from their families and only knew unfreedom until they died. The purpose of familial separation, and in Mark's case, being transported all the way from Barbados to Boston, functioned to make Black enslaved people perpetual strangers with no connections to their culture and heritage. From his childhood, Mark was literally without lifelines and was marked for death. Mark's belief that slavery was a natural condition for Black people led him to apologize in his final testimony that he killed his master, which broke up his master's family and, quote, left many innocent children and orphans, end quote. Mark indicates that he believed Codman was a kind master who, quote, let him live in Boston, end quote, with his wife. Mark repented of his sinful nature and confessed that on Sundays, he had kept bad company instead of devoting his time to prayer. However, then the story took a turn. Mark decided that he would not take full responsibility for Codman's death. He confessed that the plan to poison Codman had come from Phyllis and Phoebe, who were enslaved with him. He also claimed that after he had been caught obtaining the poison, Phoebe had visited him and told him that she would also poison him if he gave up their names. Furthermore, Mark accused Phyllis and Phoebe of setting their master's shop on fire. He insisted that he had nothing to do with it because he was sick in bed when it happened, and that when he saw the fire, he had gotten up to help save some of his master's things. Meanwhile, he said that both women took the opportunity to steal from their master while the place burned. This, Mark said, was his true account of what he and his accomplices had done. As he prepared to die, he now fashioned himself as a penitent man who was guilty of many sins. He had one last piece of advice for other enslaved people. He added that his advice would be especially useful for enslaved women. He advised them to learn from his example, to shun their vices. Mark thought that God had set him apart as, quote, a monument of awful justice, but of hope of his sharing mercy too, end quote. As you can see, 4 white men, including a man who was married by Timothy Cutler, signed off on this testimony. Mark's dying testimony has taken up so much space in my imagination because I was surprised to find that someone who was so connected to Old North had borne witness and endorsed Mark's state-sanctioned execution. This execution would have been a public spectacle for those who witnessed it and a visual reminder to all of the risks of resisting white supremacist authority. A member of this congregation that was so known for its ritual and restraint participated in this violent and public celebration of white supremacy. However, what has really haunted me about Mark's testimony is that on his way to the grave, he did not blame white supremacy for his participation in the scheme to kill his master. Instead, he blamed his own lack of piety. Even worse, Mark used his dying testimony to blame Black enslaved women for his fate. He encouraged enslaved people, and especially enslaved women, to shun their vices and to turn to God instead. Mark's advice to Black women to turn toward God and away from their rage about white supremacy is part of the enduring legacy of white supremacist interpretations of Christianity in the United States. Boston's mass reprinting of this testimony with no caveats indicates that the city endorsed slavery, state-sanctioned executions of Black people who dared to defy slavery, and white supremacist interpretations of Christianity. We're now going to transition into our Q&A time, or as I prefer to describe it, our time to think together. You can ask a question in the chat for Catherine to read aloud. You can also use the chat to share your comments and ideas. If you want to continue the conversation with me, you can email me at jcrumley@oldnorth.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaimie. This has been fascinating. And we do have some questions in the chat, so let me do that. One person has asked, there have been compliments about your research and gratitude toward you for it. One question. In your discussion of Gedney Clark, you mentioned a couple of times the illicit trade channels. Were Clark's merchant ventures illegal?
Great question. So I really enjoyed reading Jared Hardesty's book, which I mentioned, and I do recommend it because he really paints the picture of all of these networks of trade and how even while a lot of governments understood that what a lot of these mariners were doing was not exactly legal, how they're kind of like turning a blind eye to it. Like, yeah, come into our port, don't stay too long, hurry up and do what you're doing. And everyone's just kind of taking advantage of that. And I think it connects so well also to our present moment in which there are so many people who figure out ways to do something that's just kind of not quite the right way to do things, and how much, I think we can really learn from these stories about the ways that, a lot of people are unwittingly or wittingly complicit in systems that are not quite above board. So yes, Gidney Clark and his associates were definitely engaging in extra legal activities.
Another question is, were you using original documentation located at Old North?
So all of the documents that I showed you today are from either the Massachusetts Historical Society. Some, as I mentioned, were from the Lambeth Palace Archives in London. Some I found through digital archives. We do have archival materials at Old North, but I was really excited to get into some of these archival sources and to take a look around.
More compliments are coming in. Okay. Perhaps, like you've alluded to, Black feminists. Wait. As an archivist at a community archive, the collection can feel limited in scope of collection by what is donated. How can archives ensure that primary sources of marginalized groups are included for future researchers?
Great. Yeah, Sarah, that is a great question. And I think it's such a complicated question about what we can find, what we can't find, also about who had the privilege of writing things down, about also whose materials we choose to hold on to, in the past, not present archivists, but whose materials were considered to be quote unquote worthy of archives. I was listening the other day to a podcast by a scholar who works on the gay community in Holocaust era Germany. And he was talking about how there had been active efforts by state archives to just actively destroy records about gay history so that they could make space for things that were considered to be more worthy of the archive. So that's something else that we're also up against. We can't obviously find what's not there. I think one thing that's also important for scholars to remember as we do our work is to think more capaciously about what represents archival material. Of course, everything that I showed is textual, and I tend to lean toward textual archives because I just like to read what's on the page. But there are so many other artifacts, art pieces, so much more that we can learn from than just what's ended up being written in a document. But thank you for that question. I think that's kind of like an ongoing challenge, both for the scholars and for the archivist.
Another question is, do you know what happened to the two women that Mark, I don't know, named, I guess, as co-conspirators, if we want to call them that? Phoebe and
Phyllis.
Phyllis, yeah.
I know that one of the women, according to his document, was giving testimony. It sounds like maybe she was trying to defend herself, but she was trying to give testimony. My assumption is that they suffered Mark's fate and maybe just didn't respond to it in the same way that Mark did, kind of just, I'll give up everybody right now, which is why I'm assuming we have Mark's document. But yeah, I don't know for sure, especially with him being labeled as Mark about 30. It's really difficult to find out more about him than just what we find in this one document, and certainly difficult to find out anything about Phyllis and Phoebe. And the book I'm actually referring to, the Jared, yes, thank you, Emily. Yeah, Mutiny on the Rising Sun.
Following the Quock Walker and Elizabeth Friedman cases in the 1780s, how did the rulings affect the Old North congregation?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's from Delaney. Thank you for that question. So, at Old North, of course, there were people, as I said, who were enslavers and continued to hold enslaved people in the congregation all the way up through the 1780s, through 1781. And I have yet to find any freedom petitions from Black Old Northers. However, we do have the freedom petition of Belinda Royal, and we know that the Royal family is a really big family here in Massachusetts during the colonial period. And Belinda Royal was enslaved by that family, and the Royal family, some of its members attended Old North. So Belinda herself, as far as we know, did not attend Old North, but she was one of the kind of leading people who was advocating for Black freedom, which is, I think, an exciting thing for us to look into.
Could you talk a little more about how we should read sources like Mark's testimony? You know, you mentioned Marissa Fuentes, who talks about reading with the grain, and I'm wondering how you think we should approach this these types of documents, especially in New England history.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so challenging. I love Marissa Fuentes' work, and her work is on Bridgetown, Barbados, and so it's like pretty, I think, it fits really well with the research that I'm doing, because of course that's part of the larger British Empire. And I think Black feminists have offered so many methods, you know, beyond reading against the grain, but also reading along, you know, the archival grain, so that we can just expand the legibility of the sources and also imagine what might not be there. And I think it's part of it is you know, reading a little bit of everything. Like I said, I mean, I read Mark's testimony literally for a break because the church records are just like, they're some of the things that I showed you all. They're like, thank Mr. Clark for the bells. You know? And it's like, okay, I need a break. I need to read something else. I want to read something that's centering a Black subject. And so literally that's why I read it. And then I was just so shocked to see that a member of Old North was involved in this really disgusting public display of white supremacy. And so I think part of it is not being afraid to read across different archival materials, but also to the question from earlier about how we find things and how we locate things. Reading things that might not necessarily seem to fit together, and thinking about how they might fit together because they were all happening at the same time, or because they're all connected to British imperial history. I think it takes a little bit of creativity and finessing. I think it's like a fine dance.
Do you want me to hold the basket so you can?
Hold the basket.
We have another expression of gratitude for your work, and then a question. What do you hope to see as we take what is history into how we live our own current existence in an ongoing white supremacist reality that continues in such an increasingly obvious way?
Oh, okay. You all are asking hard-hitting questions tonight. I love it. I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you. I also am so interested, as I'm reading this question, that the word history is written in quotation marks, and I wonder what that's about. I don't know if I disagree with it. I just would love for us to be able to have more conversation. And Moritz, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, about why it is that you're putting the word history in quotation marks. You know, as I said earlier, my degree is in gender studies, and I happen to use archival materials just because I love stories and I love thinking about the past. And I also love thinking about the way that the past and understanding the past helps us to understand the present, not in the sense that we don't make the same mistakes from the past, but rather in the sense that we understand that we are all tangled up with the past, and that some of the things that have happened in the past and even that are happening in the present, unfortunately, that is incommensurable violence. We can't undo it. We can only hope to become better. I think it's also important to remember that two things can be true at the same time, right? Like I'm thinking about, for example, I was just in Canada and we went to a great museum. I'll have to tell you all about it, Catherine, later. But we went to a fantastic museum that was about a 19th century politician who was the guy who basically, he and his crew of seedy politicians, they worked together to turn all of these different parts of Canada into one Canada. Like whether people liked it or not, they were going to force that issue because they understood the kind of economic goals that they were trying to gain from that. And it's so fascinating because, of course, being in Canada now, and there was a great kind of interactive game at the museum where it was showing the different numbers of kind of Indigenous peoples and how the population was so depleted through this experience, but also different European groups that ended up coming to Canada and when and why they came. But also this rising number of Indigenous peoples, as more Indigenous peoples today are actually being recognized as who they are because of shifts in the law, from basically making Indigenous women who married outside of their communities not Indigenous anymore and forcing them to incorporate themselves into Canada, as opposed to incorporating themselves into the communities that they actually came from. And so I find that the more we learn this history, we can't undo what has been done, but we can learn from it to be better. And I think some of the choices, not all, that the Canadian government has made in the past few years has been part of that work of figuring out how do we move forward together. We can't undo the past, but we can create a better future.
Anne clarified or explained what she meant by history. It refers to our ability as white folks to see the past as the past and pretend that we are beyond that. In other words, to deny that history is who we may still be. Yeah, there is a tendency, I think, to think of the history as set, concrete, done, versus the plasticity that it really has when you start to incorporate other voices and recognize other stories. Then suddenly history isn't what it was, it's something that's in a way becoming. Okay. Wondering if you have any insight on whether churches located in the countryside were also attended by slave owners, compared to Old North, that is, where some members were part of the Atlantic slave trade. The Congregational Church Library in Boston may have older records and answers. I hadn't thought about the inland villages and towns before as possible locations of enslaved people in New England.
So I haven't done work on, I've mostly done work on urban congregations. And so I haven't done work on the countryside. But what I do know is that most enslaved people in New England were actually held in New Hampshire, which is interesting. And yeah, so there was a lot of diversity about what it looked like to be an enslaved person in colonial New England, and a wide variety of things that enslaved people did, depending on where exactly it is that they lived. And thank you, Mimi, for that comment.
Yeah, I'm also thinking, Jaimie, about your newest video, the one that's going up, I think today or tomorrow, where you talk about the documents from all of the towns in the various counties in Massachusetts that were reporting in about enslaved people over the age of 16. And so that would imply kind of widespread presence and potentially widespread church engagement. Okay. These have been some really meaty, wonderful questions. And being mindful of the hour, I would love to encourage you all to reach out to Jaimie with your questions. Her email, she put that up earlier. We'll put that again in the chat. Alternatively, you can just reach out to us through our website, and it's remarkable how quickly we can figure out the right person for the questions that you send in. Jason, thank you for putting Jaimie's email in there. This has been a fascinating and I think a great beginning. And I'm looking forward to your next talk as you get a little deeper into your research. But in the meanwhile, I do encourage everybody who hasn't to watch the videos that Jaimie's producing. They follow a similar approach of finding a document and diving on into it and then reading it in a way that elucidates people's lives. So thank you, Jason. The link for those videos is also in the chat. And I want to join everyone in thanking you, Jaimie, for your work. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for being with us tonight. So have a
Thank
good
you.
evening, everybody.